understand the psychology of a person, it is not enough that we learn about their cognitive processes, how they think, the way the mind functions, or maybe how the brain structure is, their biological approach, like what are the neurochemicals or other chemicals being released in their brain which is affecting their psychology. So only cognitive approach and biological approach is not enough to understand the psychology of a person. It is also very important to understand the socio-cultural approach of the person, because there are a lot of things in the society, in their environment, that is continuously influencing the psychology of a person. So the person's behavior, person's personality is shaped up by the kind of society they stay in, the kind of parents they have, their family background, their siblings, their teachers, their neighborhood, the culture, the religion, the country, and so on. So all the things that are around us are continuously influencing our and shaping our behavior and our personality. So it is very important when we study psychology to study the socio-cultural approach. So today we are going to talk about how culture has an influence on the psychology of a person. So before we actually start how culture has an effect on the psychology of a person, let's understand what is culture. Culture is a set of beliefs, set of attitudes and behavior that exist within a group of people. So there is a group of people, let's say a society, a country, a state, or maybe let's say a family. They have their own culture. They all have a similar kind of religion, similar kind of behavior, similar kind of attitude. Now imagine you are at your home. So in your home, there will be like certain rituals that only you people follow. Maybe, there is a particular routine that only you people follow. Or there is a set of beliefs that this is to be done, this is good, this is bad, not going late outside. Not going outside very late, or things like that probably is your set of, rules and regulations that are there in your family. So there is a set kind of belief and set kind of attitudes and behaviors that are there in a particular culture, and this culture can be within the family or within the society or some area. So this kind of culture is continuously influencing the kind of person you are, the way you think. It is continuously influencing that. These traditions and this culture is always carried from one generation to the next, and that is how it is being done from each generation. It keeps getting passed on to the next generation, and we are also resistant to a change. Like for example, if I come from a culture, I come from a background where it is absolutely okay for women to go outside and work, okay, and all of a sudden if I move to a culture where women are not allowed to work, or they are looked down upon if they are into kind of glamorous world, modeling, acting and so on. So maybe I'll not be very comfortable in that kind of culture, because that is not me, and it'll be very difficult for me to change myself to be a part of that culture. So that is the reason. Or maybe to move to a culture where marriages are not given much of importance and there is only live-in relationships happening, and maybe in my culture the terminology of relationships and marriage is altogether very different from the Western culture. So what happens exactly when a person moves from one culture to the other culture? They feel a lot of difference, due to which they can feel little uncomfortable, and usually human beings are resistant to the change in their set beliefs and culture, because they've born into a certain kind of culture, their own culture, and they have been grown up like that in a set pattern of rules and norms. So every person is resistant to that kind of a change. A cultural norm is a set of rules based on socially or culturally shared beliefs of how an individual ought to behave to be accepted within that group. Norms regulate behavior within a group. When individuals deviate from social or cultural norms, they may be punished, marginalized, stigmatized, or more positively seen as creative and effecting change in the society. Being social animals, the need to belong plays a strong role in the desire to conform to group norms. So for example, maybe let's say this is just an example, just an assumption. In my culture, it is not good that a woman goes out in a glamorous world and step into modeling or fashion show or any skin revealing kind of a place that they should work into. So this is not this does not happen in my culture. This is just an example that I'm giving it to you. So let's say it is like that. So in such a case, what happens? And if I really want to become a model and I just kind of go against the social norms, the norms of my society, and I go for that particular thing or particular job, what happens? The society starts to marginalize. They keep it distant. They keep they don't like that you are being a rebel. You are looked as a rebel of that society. The reason is because you are not in sync with the norms of that culture. So cultural norms are very important, and many people or most of the people are not very comfortable to break those norms and go against those norms, because being a social animal, human being as a social animal, we do not like to stay isolated. We always like to have a belongingness to a certain group or culture. We have a need of belonging to a certain group. So if we do not have a group, we are not a part of that pack, or we are not part of a certain group or culture, we feel having a no social identity of our own, so which gives us jitters. So it is important that a person feels that social identity, that I'm a part of this particular group, this particular religion, this particular culture. So this is a very important thing as a social identity for a person. So we'll be talking about, there are two different identities, personal identity and social identity. Right now we are talking about the social identity. So which is a very important thing for a person, and to maintain that, a person usually tries not to rebel it, not to go against the social norms. So we try to stay within the social norms, and our psychology also gets affected by the same. Culture is how we describe food and eating habits, gender roles, rituals, communication patterns, and use of free time within a society. When we talk about culture, we refer either to a surface culture or deep culture. So let's understand what is surface culture and what is deep culture. Surface culture is something that is very very visible, and you can clearly see when two different groups meet each other. In surface culture, let's say one is Japanese and the other is Indian. So we'll see that how the way they sit and eat their food, the kind of food that they are eating, with whom all they are sitting and eating their food, the kind of music that they listen to, the way they are managing their family, how they are behaving with each other in their family. So all these things are very different in a Japanese family or an Indian family or an American family. So these differences are quite visible. This is called as surface culture. On other hand, deep culture means your beliefs, your values, your attitudes, how you think, what what is your attitude or behavior in a certain manner. That is a deep culture, and social psychologists are more interested in understanding the deep culture, to study that how the individual differences actually occur. So one your group of a society, let's say an American society, would be very different from a Japanese society. So the way they treat the opposite gender, what are their beliefs, how they are going to make their career, or what kind of careers are important for them, how they have certain belief or the respect of authority, or maybe towards their elders, their perception towards their career or their job prospects or whatever it is. So all these things are included in the deep culture. So studying deep culture actually gives us a very good idea that what are the individual differences and how a person differs from one culture to the other culture. Here you can see a diagram that culture is divided into two: cultural norms and cultural dimensions. Cultural norms are further divided into surface culture and deep culture, which I just now told you. Cultural dimensions will be studying later on, which includes individualism, collectivism, long-term, short-term orientation. And all of these have an effect on four important things, that is conformity, memory, two system thinking, strategic planning. So when we talk about culture and cultural norms, it is not, something that we consciously make an effort. Deliberately, we learn things in our family, like maybe rituals are there or beliefs or attitudes are there. It's not that we consciously think about it and adapt to it. This is something which happens very subconsciously. In our daily lives we are continuously into a certain kind of a routine. We're into certain kind of a behavior, a certain kind of set of beliefs that we believe in. Maybe we have learned this from our grandparents or parents who are there in our, like, other family members who are there in the family. So we are continuously learning from them, and when we are learning from them, it is happening every single day. It is not that we are deliberately thinking and adapting to it. It happens subconsciously, so we don't even realize that what all are we thinking. And whatever we learn, the beliefs and the attitudes, we think that this is what normal is, this is how the life works, and this is how a normalization you is there in the life. And we are completely unaware of how things happen in other cultures or other families. It is only when we meet people from other cultures or other families, other society or other country people, that we get to know that their attitudes, beliefs, their culture is so different from us. Their routine, their way of thinking, way of life is so different from us. It is only then we get to know. Otherwise we think that whatever we are doing, it is very, very normal, and because of this we think that it is very normal. It has an effect on our psychology, and that is how our personality and our psychology is shaped up. I will give you a very good example of this. One very interesting example is of giving the gifts. Okay, now in some cultures what happens is, when guests come to your place and they give the gift to you, in places like India or maybe some of the Asian countries, they take the gift and they keep it aside. They do not open in front of the guest, because you don't want the guest to see that you are being desperate and want to see, very curious, being very desperate, that what is there in the gift. So you, and maybe your expressions, just in case you don't like the gift or something, it should not come on your expressions that you did not like the gift, and the guest should not get to know this. So we do not open the gift in front of the guest, or whenever birthday parties are happening, when people give us the gifts, birthday gifts, we never open in front of them and we keep it aside. It is only once the guests leave, after they are gone, we start opening the gifts, and probably then decide whether we want to keep it or pass on, or what we have to do with it. Okay, so that's just altogether a separate issue, but yes, this is one thing that happens in some of the cultures, and this is very normal for such people. Now in some cultures, like in Western side, maybe in America side or so, the culture is that when somebody comes over and hands you over the gift, you open in front of them. So you tend to appreciate that, okay, this is what you have brought for me, and thank you so much, I appreciate. So you appreciate, you see the gift in front of them. If you keep it aside, just like usually Indians do that, if you keep it aside, it is an insult that somebody is giving you the gift and you just kept it aside, you kind of ignored it, you didn't even open it. So they are going to feel very offended that what kind of behavior is this. So in their culture it is very different. You open the gift in front of them and see, admire, and appreciate and thank them for the same. So these are small things like gift giving, or maybe restaurant etiquettes, paying of the bill, and so on. These are small things that are different from culture to culture, and we cannot judge a person on these things. It is important that we know the cultural background of a person when we need to make a judgment on a person, because maybe they have been grown up in such a culture where these things are very normal. Let's understand the difference between enculturation and acculturation. Many students get very confused between both the terms, so let's understand what is it. Enculturation means that when we internalize the schemas of our own culture. That is when, let's say, there is a small baby or a toddler, a small child, when they are in the family, they are learning the beliefs, attitudes and other things from set of beliefs from their own family. For example, learning your mother tongue, this is enculturation. So you are making the schemas of your own culture. There is a routine, there are set of beliefs, there are a certain kind of attitudes that run in my family. So I have learned those, that this is how the role of a mother is, this is how the role of a father is, and this is how families stay together. So these kind of things is while I'm seeing all this is happening in my family. So when I encounter that this is all is happening in my family, I am learning these things and making schema of my mother, schema of a family, schema of my father, schema of religion, schema of belief, schema of attitudes, and so on. So these all schemas of my culture are ingrained, internalized in my own mind. That is called enculturation. Whereas acculturation is different. Now what happens, I'm talking about acculturation now. This whole world is getting globalized. There is no culture that is isolated. We are not in isolation. People all the time, they are moving in and out, maybe on vacation, maybe migrating to other places for work or for whatever reason. So people are coming to our country, we are going to other people's country, we are settling down there, or we marry a person from other culture altogether. So what is happening when we are getting mixed up, when we are meeting each other? There is a part of small elements of culture, not the whole culture, but the elements of culture that gets transferred. So maybe in my culture, this is the way I dress up. These are the timings I go out. This is the kind of work that I do. But the moment I go to some other culture, other country altogether, let's say, there women have a different set of, dressing up, different set of jobs that they prefer. So maybe I adapt those few elements from their culture. This is called acculturation. When you adapt to different culture, you don't take the whole culture as it is, but you just kind of mix a bit of both culture, your culture, and taking the elements from their culture. That is called acculturation. So I hope now you're clear with what is enculturation and acculturation. If you have not understood, please write in the comments below. I'll explain with further more examples. Now let's understand another very important terminology, explicit and implicit under the terminology culture. Now in culture, what is explicit and what is implicit? Now let's say a culture is not just of a country, it can be of a particular area, society, even a school or an institution. So culture can be of a larger area like a country, or a smaller place like a school even. Okay, so let's take an example of school here. Now in here, there are some rules that are written, exclusively mentioned, maybe in the handbook, diary, or somewhere. For example, that boys are not allowed to wear shorts in the school. If they wear shorts in the school, they will be punished. Only full pants are allowed. Now this is a rule that is there in the organization, in the school, which is written. So this is called explicit. Now there are some rules which are not written. It is simply understood. For example, in the morning everybody greets each other. So greeting is a unsaid rule. Nowhere in the handbook it's written that you have to greet your teachers, you have to greet your co-workers or other students, your classmates, or anybody. It is not written anywhere. It is simply understood that this is our culture. We always greet everyone when we meet in the morning. So this is unsaid rule, is known as implicit. I hope you understand the difference between explicit and implicit in culture. So every culture, be it a country, be it an area, every culture has some written rules. This is allowed, this is not allowed. If you don't agree to, or you don't follow the adhere to the guidelines, you'll be punished. And then there are some unsaid rules. It is simply understood that this is how we have to follow. That is called implicit. Let's understand what is ethic approach and emic approach in culture. Now what happens in, sometimes the researcher is from a certain culture and they want to study people from different countries altogether or different cultures altogether. In this scenario, in this case, the researcher is looking at different culture from their own lens, from my personal lens. For example, I am a researcher, I am Indian, and I am seeing the other cultures. I want to do research in America, I want to do research in London or some other cultures, and I see their problems as a very universal scenario, as a very common human behavior. This is a general human behavior that happens to everybody. So I make a hypothesis as a researcher before even going to the field, before actually carrying out my research, because I feel this is something universal and can be generalized throughout anywhere at all, irrespective of the culture. For example, depression. Now depression is like feeling very, very sad, and then there are other symptoms of depression. Of course, we are not going too much into it. So if I want to study depression, now depression, I feel as a researcher, is same in America, same in London, same in Australia, same in India, same in China. Depression is same amongst the human being, irrespective of their culture. So I plan to study, I plan to take an approach that is called ethic approach, that is universal in nature and that can be applied to anybody. Now in this scenario, I make a hypothesis and I try, doing the research, take the approach, the procedure in a very universal manner. Now second is emic approach. Emic approach is that sometimes there are a few things which are very cultural specific, and I as a researcher need to understand the culture of the people, of the participants who are going to study or who are going to participate in my study. For example, I am an Indian and I plan to do a study on people who are from China or who are from Australia or America. So I need to first go there, talk to local people, understand their language, understand their family system, their society, their do's and don'ts, their set of beliefs and attitudes, and then I start my research. For example, let's say in some societies there is a lot of conflict between the girl and the mother-in-law in the families. Then in the western side there are conflicts never much between girl and the mother-in-law. It's more between the mother-in-law and the son-in-law. So mother and son-in-law, yeah. So that is the conflict that usually happens. So each society has their own kind of conflicts, own kind of set of beliefs. So I cannot study a culture, or maybe those participants are not comfortable with me because I'm not understanding their culture. So in order to understand, in order to make them believe me, it is important that I understand their culture, their language, their society, and only then I do the research. So this is called an emic approach. In emic approach, the hypothesis is not made before going to the field. It is done after the researcher gets used to or gets mingled up with the other culture, and then only they start with the research work. Now there is a limitation, there are pros and cons of both the approaches. Ethic is important, then there are some things that are universally true across all the cultures. So ethic approach can be more generalized. We can replicate the study, we can do the study more number of times across the different cultures. So that is ethic approach. Sometimes some studies are to be done only very cultural specific, that is emic approach. So the problem is that we cannot use this kind of approach everywhere and the studies cannot be replicated. So I hope you understood the difference between ethic approach and emic approach. Again, if you have not understood anything, please feel free to write in the comments below. I will make you understand with more better examples, and I might upload another video for the same. Now, culture has a very important role in the development of our schemas. How we remember, what we remember, how we store the information, all these things are very cultural specific. So culture has a huge role in it, because like maybe in my culture, for example, there are certain words that are used more and certain words we don't use. So probably I'm likely to remember the words we use more. For example, in India, they use the word capsicum more, like on the pizza. If I'm talking about the toppings that I need on the pizza, I say capsicum. I want capsicum as a topping on my pizza. So this is something that I am likely to remember. It is there in my memory because it is used more in my culture. The same thing, if we go western side, let's say we go to America and we are ordering a pizza, we don't say capsicum, we say bell peppers. So I want bell peppers as a topping on my pizza. So there is a difference. So there are certain words and there are certain behaviors and emotions that we tend to remember more because of our culture. So culture has a huge effect on the schemas that we have, on a huge effect influence on our memory storage and retrieval. So let's do a study which is going to support the effect of culture on our schema and on our psychology. This study was done by Cole and Scribner 1974. This study is to see the effect of culture, that is the attitudes and everything, on our cognitive processes. So Cole and Scribner used an emic approach to see how culture could affect memory. They wanted to see the effect that schooling would have on the strategies that children use to memorize list of words. Cole and Scribner 1974 studied the development of memory among tribal people in rural Liberia compared to children in the US. They looked at both Liberian children in school and those that were not attending school. To overcome the barriers of language and culture, these researchers observed everyday cognitive activities before conducting their experiments and worked closely with the university-educated local people who acted as experimenters. The aim of the study was to see if culture had a different effect on how one memorizes. They were given a free recall task in which they were shown a large number of objects, one at a time, and then asked to remember them. This kind of memory is called free recall because people are free to recall the items in any order they wish. So below is a list of 20 objects used in several of Cole and Scribner studies. The list shows that the objects appear to fall into 4 distinct categories. To make sure that the list was not too ethnocentric and thus foreign to the Liberian participants, the researchers ran a pilot study to make sure that Liberian participants were familiar with the words. So the words were in the 4 different categories. The first category had plate, calabash, pot, pan, cup. The second category was cutlass, hoe, knife, file, hammer. The third category, potato, onion, banana, orange, coconut. The fourth category, trousers, singlet, head tie, shirt, hat. Now, the researchers found out that unlike the children in school, the children who were not attending school shown no regular increase in memory performance after the age of 9 or 10. These participants remembered approximately 10 items on the first trial and managed to recall only 2 more items after 15 practice trials. The Liberian children who were attending school, by contrast, learned the material rapidly, much the way school children of the same age did in the United States. School children in Liberia and the United States not only learned the list rapidly, but used the categorical similarities of items in the list to aid their recall. After the first trial, they clustered the responses. For example, they would recall items of clothing, then items of food, and so on. The non-school Liberian participants did very little clustering, indicating that they were not using the categorical structure of the list to help them remember. In a later trial, the researchers varied the recall task so that the objects were now presented in a meaningful way as part of a story. The unschooled children recalled the objects easily and actually chunked them according to the roles they played in the story. Now, memory studies like these invite reflection. It seems that even though the ability to remember is universal, strategies for remembering are not universal. Generally, schooling presents children with a number of specialized information processing tasks, such as organizing large amounts of information in memory and learning to use logic and abstract symbols in problem solving. It is questionable whether such ways of remembering have parallels in tradition traditional societies like Catholic children studied by Colin Scribner. The conclusion is that people learn to remember in ways that are relevant to their everyday lives. And these do not always mirror the activities that cognitive psychologists use to investigate mental processes. So I hope you understood the study, and IB psychology students need more than 2 studies sometimes, or 2 to 4 studies to write in their answers. So let's do the second study where we are going to see the effect of culture on cognitive processes. The effect of culture on cognitive processes. One of the criticisms of memory research is that it is often carried out in Western university classrooms. Now, this creates a cultural bias in the research, which may mean that the findings cannot be easily generalized. For example, the indigenous Australians of Western Australia have followed a semi-nomadic lifestyle of hunting and gathering for almost 60,000 years. The indigenous Australian survival depends on finding their way through vast stretches of unmapped country and remembering locations of water, food, and wildlife. Their survival depends to a large extent on their ability to store or encode enormous amounts of environmental or visual information. This strongly contrasts with the demands of the average Western university student. Now, under traditional desert living conditions, water supplies ultimately determine the movement patterns of small foraging groups. In the desert, rainfall patterns are unreliable. So these movement patterns within any particular year were never duplicated. Both hunting and gathering required that people should be able to move considerable distances in different directions from camp and return without getting lost. It is unlikely that they would identify landmarks, as there are very few outstanding features in this region. However, a general sense of spatial relationships could be used to determine a location and give the hunter a sense of orientation. Accurate memory for such relationships is thus likely to have been of considerable value both in movement between water sources and in daily foraging movements from a base camp. Now, indigenous Australians tend to score low on Western verbal intelligence test. So there is this study by Judith Kiernan's 1981. He tested whether they might perform better on tests that took advantage of their ability to encode with visual cues. So Kiernan's 1981 had a sample of 44 adolescent desert indigenous Australians aged 12 to 16 years. There were 27 boys and 17 girls, and 44 adolescents, 28 boys and 16 girls of white Australian origin. The desert group came from a school drawing children from several widely separated settlements of the Western Desert region who had been raised by people living under semi-traditional tribal conditions. All spoke English as a second language. The white Australian participants were drawn from a large student population of a high school in an outer suburb of Perth. The sample was matched for age and sex. The concept of standard testing situations is culturally foreign to indigenous Australians. No testing was done until children had had time and opportunity to ask questions. Schoolrooms were not used for testing. The work was done entirely outdoors. The basic procedure was that Kiernans placed 20 objects on a board divided into 20 squares. Indigenous Australians and white Australian children were told to study the board for 30 seconds. The children were instructed that when the cover was removed, they should look hard at all the things and try to remember where they all are. And then the subsequent task was a reconstruction of the board with the objects in the same arrangement. Then all the objects were heaped into a pile in the center of the board. The children were asked to replace the items in their original locations. There were 4 variations of the task. The first was artificial different, that is AD, a collection of 20 small man-made objects likely to be familiar to white Australian children, like knife, eraser, thimble, die, ring, scissors, matchbox, and differing from each other in at least one other way, that is color, size, shape, and usage. Second was natural different, ND, a collection of 20 naturally occurring objects likely to be familiar to desert children. Feather, rock, bark, leaf, small skull, wildflower. Then artificial scene. AS. 12 small bottles arranged as a 4 by 3 matrix. Bottles differed in age, size, shape, color, but were not labeled and not commonplace, so that it would be difficult to verbally distinguish between the bottles. And last was natural scene. 12 small rocks differing in size, shape, color, texture. Now, on all the 4 tasks, the indigenous Australian children correctly relocated more objects than did white Australian children. As would be expected, the least difference between the two groups was on the artificial different task. This is the task on which the white Australian children scored the highest. The indigenous Australian children showed no significant difference whether the task was artificial or natural. This means that the objects themselves did not affect the results of the study. So according to Kearns, for many indigenous Australian children, the memory tasks seem to have been too easy. This was especially the case for the 12 item arrays, bottles or rocks, where on over half the performances, 45 out of 88, no errors were made. The 20 item arrays were apparently more difficult, although about 1/5 of performances were error-free. However, the tasks were not too easy for white Australian children. Perfect performances accounted for less than 5% of total performances on both 12 and 20 item arrays. 18% of the white Australian children managed one perfect score and none obtained 2 or more perfect scores. 75% of the indigenous Australians made at least one perfect score and 41 made at least 2 error-free performances. So that means Kearns found that the indigenous Australian children performed significantly better than the white Australian children in placing the objects into their original locations. She concluded that the survival of the indigenous Australians in the harsh desert landscape had encouraged and rewarded their ability to store and code information using visual retrieval cues. These interesting results suggest that survival needs may shape and reward a particular way of encoding information in memory. Let's do the evaluation of the study, which is also very, very important for the IB psychology students. There might be, some command terms where they need to evaluate the study, writing the strengths and the weaknesses. So let's do the evaluation. Now, the study is a quasi-experiment. That is, the independent variable is the culture, which cannot be manipulated. Therefore, the findings are correlational in nature and not able to establish a cause and effect relationship. It is also a single sample. Replications of the study would have to be done with other indigenous groups in order to determine the extent to which the correlation is reliable. It is difficult to know exactly what the reason is for this difference. Kearns argues that there must be an evolutionary root to the behavior. Since these children were not raised in the desert, they were not raised as hunters and gatherers. They were also in a school which was run by the state of Australia. Is it possible then that the memory strategies are genetic? This is highly unlikely. It is more likely, as Kearns argues, that the first generation settled parents have raised their children in a way that reflects the traditional lifestyle and values. What components of this lifestyle influence their children's ability to carry out this task so easily is rather unclear. Well, more evaluation is that, however, Kearns also collected a lot of qualitative data when carrying out her research. She noted that the indigenous Australian participants sat very still and did not engage in conversation with the researcher while they viewed the arrays set before them. While reconstructing the arrays, she observed that their reconstruction of the arrays were done with careful deliberation and their progress throughout was steady. She further observed that they were very efficient and made few placement changes after the initial placements of the objects. Before placing the object that would hold it and carefully scan the board before placing it. With regard to the Australian children, she observed they had a tendency to move around on their seats, pick up objects, turn the objects over and talk to themselves or to the researcher. She also notes that the Australian participants seemed concerned on the same item arrays about not knowing what to call the objects to distinguish them. While reconstructing the objects, she observed that the Australian children began the process in a hurry and then slowed down, and that towards by the end they tended to change their initial placements around a lot. So here we are done with 2 studies where we saw that how culture has an effect on different cognitive processes. Now I'm going to give you 3rd study. I know many students write only 2 studies for their 22 marker and only 1 study for the 9 marker, but still I'm giving you a little more studies for the students who prefer to write 3 or 4 studies for their 22 marker. And also remember that whichever cognitive process you are going to talk about, make sure that in specific knowledge you talk about the cognitive process. Like for example, now I'm going to tell you about the effect of culture on flashbulb memory. So remember to talk about what is culture and what is flashbulb memory and how culture has an effect on the flashbulb memory. So connection you show in the specific knowledge and then write the study to support what you have given in your specific knowledge. So I'm going to give you the 3rd study now. So let's do the study next. Kolkovsky et al. 2011, who carried out a study to see the role of culture on flashbulb memory. So Kolkovsky et al. 2000 carried out a study on the role of culture on flashbulb memory. The researchers studied 5 countries: China, Germany, Turkey, UK and USA, to see if there was any difference in the rate of flashbulb memories in collectivistic and individualistic cultures. The sample was made up of 274 adults from 5 different countries. All participants were identified as middle class. First, the participants were given 5 minutes to recall as many memories as they could of public events occurring in their lifetime. The events had to have occurred at least 1 year ago. The researchers then used this list of events to create a memory questionnaire. They were asked 5 questions about how they learned about the event that mirrored the original questionnaire used by Brown and Kulik 1977. The questions were: where were you when you first learnt of the event? What time of the day was it? How did you learn about it? What were you doing at the time that you learned about it? Whom were you with? They were then asked to answer questions about the importance of the event to them personally. The questions included: how nationally or internationally important was the event? How personally important was the event? How surprising was the event? How many times have you talked about the event since it happened? Now the questionnaire and instructions were constructed in English and then translated and back translated into Mandarin, Chinese, German and Turkish by bilingual research assistants. For example, that means that after they were translated into Mandarin Chinese by one of the research assistants, a different native speaker would be given the questions and ask them to translate them back into English. In this way, we can guarantee that the translation was not a confounding variable. This is an important point to note down. Then going further, the researchers found that in a collectivistic cultures like China, personal importance and intensity of emotion played less of a role in predicting FBM, compared with more individualistic cultures that place greater emphasis on an individual's personal involvement and emotional experiences. Because focusing on the individual's own experiences is often de-emphasized in the Chinese context, there would be less rehearsal of the triggering event compared with participants from other cultures and thus a lower chance of developing a FBM. However, it was found that national importance was equally linked to FBM formation across cultures. Now, of course, IB students need to evaluate the study, which is also very important. So let's do the evaluation. Evaluation says that a representative of the culture administered the test and the questionnaires were given in the native languages of the participants. This avoids interviewer effects. It also meant that since they were responding in their native language and the language in which these memories were almost created, the participants were more likely to recall these memories. The study used back translation to make sure that the translation of the questionnaires was not a confounding variable. This increases the credibility of the study. There is the danger of the ecological fallacy. Just because the participants come from the culture being studied, this does not mean that they necessarily share the traits of the culture's predominant dimensions. That is, just because I am American does not mean that I process flashbulb memories like other Americans. It is an ethic approach to researching cultural differences. It is possible that cultural factors affected how information was self-reported. It cannot be verified in the study whether those personal memories actually exist but were not reported. Next, let's understand the link between conformity and culture, how culture affects the conformity. First, we need to understand what is conformity. Conformity basically means that every person has a tendency to change themselves or adapt themselves so that they can be aligned with the group, culture, attitudes and beliefs. Because if we don't do that, maybe we are left alone, we are isolated from the culture, from the society, and nobody likes that. We all like to have that belongingness to a group. So in order to belong to a group, we like to adapt ourselves so that we can sync well with the group. We try to adapt to their culture, their beliefs, their attitudes. So this is what conformity is. So there is a link between culture and conformity. Let's do our third study, that where we will study how culture has an effect on the conformity. Well, the study was done by Perrin and Spencer in 1981, the Ash effect as a child of its time. So Perrin and Spencer went so far as to describe the Ash effect as a child of its time. Perrin and Spencer in 1980, they attempted to replicate the Ash paradigm using British students. They were studying engineering, maths and chemistry, and they found only one instance of conformity out of 396 trials, which was completely at odds with Ash's finding, that is with Perrin and Spencer in 1981. The researchers argued that the Ash effect was a relic of a particular time and place in history when conformity and obedience were valued and students weren't outspoken. So by contrast, the paradigm didn't really apply in the culture of 1980s Britain, in which students were known to speak openly about society, such was their social status. The researchers further investigated the potential role of situational factors in conformity by conducting the experiment on youths on probation with probation officers acting as confederates. This was meant to determine whether conformity might be influenced more by a person's situation than their disposition or personal characteristics. Presumably, youths on probation might conform more or less to probation officers because the probation situation could lead to more conformity. A similar variation placed alienated black youths with a white experimenter, which was also meant to investigate the influence of the situation on conformity. The researchers were interested in whether black youths would conform more to white researchers because of the situation. So in both the variations, the researchers found similar rates of conformity in comparison to Ash, Perrin and Spencer 1981. Again, the different situation did not appear to change the rates of conformity. The researchers took this to mean that if the personal cost of not conforming was too high, then participants conform at a rate similar to Ash. In other words, if not conforming is risky, then individuals appear to conform. This relates to culture as a factor because it may well be that the social costs of not conforming were high in 1950s America. The culture may have been different back then. In America in the 1950s, students were assumed and encouraged to be conforming members of the society and to allow majority opinion. That changed later, especially during the 1960s, as student groups began to be at the forefront of demands for social change, openly questioning the norms and values of society. Perrin and Spencer make a cultural argument against Ash paradigm, but it's worth noting that they used engineering and math students in the replication. It's very possible that such students were better able to make accurate line estimates. In this respect, the Ash effect failed not because of culture, but because of confidence. Perrin and Spencer initially concluded that British culture was less conformist than American culture, but the use of engineering participants challenges that. Furthermore, rates of conformity was similar to Ash's finding when Perrin and Spencer used non-engineering students. So culture may be a factor in conformity, but the Perrin and Spencer study doesn't make that completely clear. So the last study that I gave you was not a supporting study, it was a counter argument. So in this chapter of the culture, the effect of culture on our psychology, we have two supporting studies, clearing of the concepts of course, and one counter argument. So you can very well write in the command terms to what extent and in the discuss command term, the supporting study and the counter arguments. So I hope you understood the chapter well, and if you have any questions, anything that you have not understood, please feel free to write in the comments below and I would try my best to answer your questions. And if you liked my video, please like, share and subscribe.